Now, C-PTSD came in now much later, and much later came in, which means that ICD-11 has just introduced it. However, the concept of complex post-traumatic stress disorder was basically introduced by a psychologist, Judith Herman. So she had written a book. So she was working with women who were victims and survivors of sexual abuse and domestic violence for prolonged periods of time. And she noticed that victims of these persistent violence and persistent sexual abuse had certain characteristics that made them believe that there are certain personality changes and certain long-term changes that happen when somebody's exposed to a trauma for a longer period of time, repetitive or a longer period of time, or let's say since childhood, and very intense form of traumatic experiences. Now, here in complex post traumatic stress disorder, usually CPTSD, complex trauma, is used to define trauma that is chronic. Chronic means something that's ongoing. Now, when we say trauma that is ongoing, it doesn't mean that the individual is always experiencing a bigger traumatic event. What they meant to say that when an individual has experienced traumatic experience and it leads to certain personality changes and behavior changes, it also makes them more vulnerable to re-traumatization. Now, that re-traumatization adds on to the chronic trauma. The personality changes, the mood, the affect, all of that adds up and makes that trauma chronic, or otherwise they are usually stuck in the same situation or same place, especially abusive relationships, long-term abusive relationships, neglected households, broken households, where we see that the similar patterns of trauma are being repeated unless and they become a major part of the personality. So CPTSD diagnosis, yes, adverse childhood experiences. Now CPTSD, when we talk about CPTSD, it's basically a combination of two things, where they mentioned, of course, PTSD, because they noticed that there were certain symptoms and characteristics of PTSD. But along with that, in ICD-10 and also in DSM, they had earlier, under the category of stress related disorders or stress related problems, they also had mentioned about something called enduring personality changes after catastrophic experiences, which means that for a very long time we have recognized that after certain catastrophic adverse experiences, people are more vulnerable to experiencing long-term personality changes. Basically, it disrupts the sense of a healthy personality organization, which is almost impossible to prevent because of trauma being chronic. Second, because of those personality changes, it also leads to re-traumatization. Now, it's basically when they introduce complex PTSD, they mentioned that, of course, we have basic three characteristics of PTSD, but along with that, we also have chronic and pervasive disturbances in emotional regulation, identity, and relationships. Now, here we can have a sustained exposure to trauma, which can be ongoing, or we can even have multiple exposures to trauma. Now, here it could be, for example, a lot of people might not have broken homes or neglected childhood or abuse, but they might be victims of community violence and ongoing community violence, ongoing domestic violence, even if they might be just audience, or they might be just somebody who's viewing the domestic violence happening. They might not be direct survivors of domestic violence, but they do know that they're part of homes where domestic violence is a day-to-day scenario. So studies have shown that a couple of things where CPTSD is related to, which is childhood adversities, emotional neglect being the first one, childhood sexual and physical abuse. Here, we're going to focus on three words in understanding what CPTSD entails is. One is sustained, second is multiple exposures, and three is trauma, which means, so trauma is what happens to you, which is, let's say, an event, let's say a painful event or a painful event that leads to a wound, but also what doesn't happen to you. And what doesn't happen to us would mean unmet needs, neglect, right? Abusive relationship where we're constantly unseen, rejected. So what has not happened to you is also a part of traumatic experiences. Can we move to the next slide, please? Now, because they are traumatic experiences, because they're extremely threatening and horrific, now the thing is that for different people, traumatic experiences could mean different things. Which is why we always say, right, whenever a client comes to you, the idea is to keep an open-mindedness in terms of a trauma-informed approach. So when we're talking about CPTSD, what we'll also talk about here is that we'll keep in mind that looking at it from a trauma informed approach. Anybody here who would like to share anything they know about trauma informed approaches? What do you think would a trauma informed approach tell you to now up until this point? What would trauma informed approach tell you to look at it? How would you like to look at this with a trauma informed approach? Anyone here? Let's make it more practical, no? What
Ma'am,
would
could you reframe the question, ma'am? I didn't get it properly. Could you reframe the question, please?
sorry, I don't see who's speaking. Sorry, my just a second, let me.
Ma'am, it's Shashi. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Now got it. So what I'm saying is, if you had to look at CPTSD from a trauma-informed approach, up until just this point, how would you take down symptoms from a client with that trauma-informed approach? Let's also make it practical, right? Let's say a client walks into your
Compassionate
coming.
inquiry. Compassionate inquiry is what has been followed, right?
Yes, okay, good. Good. Any questions you'd like to share that you would be asking as a part of, let's say the client has come and is opening up about going through some childhood adverse experiences, or let's say they say that, oh, I haven't had a good childhood. So for example, a lot of times in therapy, a lot of times when you're working with clients with a history of trauma, because they're also self-aware that a lot of childhood things have played a role in their present symptoms, they might, let's say, walk into the room and say, so I have been planning to start therapy for a while, I've been not feeling that great, and I've had a very difficult and painful childhood. Now, from that perspective, how do you think using a trauma informed approach you would address or you would ask questions? Because that would be followed in helping a client with CPTSD also. Anyone here? How would we start? How do we start inquiry?
Ma'am, first of all, by creating a safe environment.
Right? Sounds good. Sounds good.
And
Okay.
instead
And
of
how would you
asking
do that?
questions like, what's wrong with you, we could ask, what happened to you?
Okay. Would that be the first question you would like
Not
to
the first
ask?
question. First.
Right, because understand that people with CPTSD symptoms or trauma or a history of trauma might also have hypervigilance. So that first interaction with the client is going to be very, very important. Why I'm talking about this right now is because we're gonna use this in the third day as well. And if we don't kind of keep working it side by side, then it'll be very hard for you to understand the management part. So the first would always be, how would you create that environment, because you will also have to work with them. खाली diagnosis के बाद भी और diagnosis करने के लिए भी आपको उनसे बात करनी पड़ेगी, right? To understand that when you elicit symptoms, when you elicit responses, it can bring up a lot of memories. It can bring up a lot of discomfort. They might know I come from painful childhood, but we don't know how ready they are to open up about things. So, what are some of the questions, or what would you like to do as a first step when we're dealing with clients with, let's say, a history of chronic trauma?